Picture this. Within 48 hours, an entire nation's youth exploded in rage. Parliament buildings engulfed in flames, prime ministers fleeing by helicopter, and a government brought to its knees by teenagers with smartphones. This isn't a movie script. This is Nepal in September 2025, where a simple social media ban triggered the most violent uprising the Himalayan nation has witnessed since its civil war ended. What started as anger over blocked Facebook accounts became something far more dangerous. A generational revolt against decades of corruption, economic failure, and political nepotism. By the time the smoke cleared, 22 people were dead, hundreds injured, and a prime minister had resigned in disgrace. But how did a country known for Mount Everest and peaceful Buddhist monasteries become the epicenter of South Asia's most explosive youth movement? The answer reveals a perfect storm of economic desperation, political corruption, and digital age activism that should serve as a warning to governments worldwide. On September 5th, 2025, Nepal's government made what would prove to be a catastrophic decision. Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli's administration banned 26 social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, and TikTok, claiming these companies had failed to register with local authorities. For most countries, this might have caused grumbling. For Nepal, it was like cutting off oxygen. Nepal has one of the highest per capita social media usage rates in South Asia, with these platforms serving as lifelines connecting families separated by economic migration. Remember, Nepal is heavily dependent on remittances from overseas workers. Over 2 million Nepalis work abroad, sending home approximately $11 billion annually, representing 26.6% of the nation's GDP. When the government blocked social media, they effectively severed communication between breadwinners working in Gulf countries and their families back home. But the social media ban was merely the match that lit a much larger powder keg. Nepal's economy has been struggling for decades, with unemployment consistently above 10% for over 30 years, currently sitting at 10.7%. Among youth aged 15 to 29, unemployment reaches a staggering 19.2%. Nepal remains one of Asia's poorest countries, with per capita GDP of just $5,737, half the South Asian average and one-fourth the global average. Despite receiving massive remittances, domestic investment has plummeted from 33.8% of GDP in 2014 to just 24.45% in 2024. For Nepal's youth, the promise of democracy has proven hollow. Instead of job creation or industrial growth, they face a stagnant economy where the only option for many is migration to work in dangerous conditions abroad. In the weeks leading up to the protests, something unprecedented was happening on Nepal's social media platforms. Young Nepalis were using hashtags like #politicians, Nepo Baby Nepal, #Nepo Kids, and #Nepo Baby to expose the lavish lifestyles of politicians' children. These Nepo Kids were flaunting designer goods and luxury lifestyles funded by their parents' positions, while ordinary Nepalis struggled with poverty and unemployment. One protest placard captured the rage perfectly. The leader's children return from abroad with Gucci bags, the people's children in coffins. This wasn't just about inequality, it was about systematic corruption. Nepal ranks 107th out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, scoring just 34 out of 100 points. The Political Corruption Index shows Nepal significantly above the world average for corruption. Nepal's political instability is legendary. Since becoming a democratic republic in 2008, the country has had 14 different governments, with none completing a full 5-year term. K.P. Sharma Oli himself was serving his 4th stint as Prime Minister. This revolving door of leadership has created a system where the same elderly politicians, all facing corruption allegations, cycle in and out of power, while nothing improves for ordinary citizens. Young Nepalis were seeing the same leaders who had been in power for 10 to 15 years, continuing to enrich themselves while the country stagnated. On September 8th, thousands of young Nepalis, many still in school uniforms, gathered at Maitagar Mandala in Kathmandu. What started as a protest against the social media ban quickly escalated when demonstrators attempted to breach the federal parliament building. The crowd was unprecedented. Tens of thousands of participants with no formal political leadership. This was organic. Grassroots rage led entirely by Gen Z activists who had organized through social media before the ban. When protesters tried to storm Parliament, security forces responded with devastating force. Police deployed tear gas, water cannons, rubber bullets, and according to Amnesty International, live ammunition. By the end of the day, 19 people were dead and 347 injured. The imagery was shocking. Young protesters using the Straw Hat Pirates' Jolly Roger flag from the anime One Piece, similar to Indonesia's recent protests, while facing down government forces. This wasn't traditional political activism. This was a new generation using digital age symbols to challenge power. If Monday was explosive, Tuesday was apocalyptic. Despite the government lifting the social media ban on Monday evening, the protests had transformed into something far larger, a complete rejection of Nepal's political establishment. Enraged by the deaths, protesters defied curfews and launched coordinated attacks across Kathmandu. The federal parliament building was set ablaze. Prime Minister Oli's residence was attacked and burned. President Ram Chandra Pudel's private residence was torched. Homes of multiple ministers and political leaders were set on fire. The headquarters of major political parties were vandalized. Even former prime ministers like Sher Bahadur Deuba and Pushpa Kamal Dahal had their homes attacked. The violence was so intense that helicopters were used to evacuate government ministers to safety. Tribhuvan International Airport was shut down as the army took control. International airlines canceled flights, and neighboring India placed its border on high alert. Faced with unprecedented violence and his own residence on fire, Prime Minister Oli announced his resignation on Tuesday evening. In his resignation letter to President Pudel, he wrote, "Given the challenging circumstances in the nation, I have chosen to resign today to facilitate a political resolution in line with the Constitution." But Oli's resignation did nothing to calm the protests. Demonstrators celebrated by surging into the parliament complex, with one boldly writing, "We won," in large orange letters on the parliament wall. The message was clear. This wasn't just about removing one leader. This was about rejecting the entire political system. To understand why Nepal's youth exploded with such fury, you need to understand the economic desperation driving their generation. Nepal's economy is increasingly dependent on remittances, but this dependence comes at a terrible human cost. Young Nepalis are leaving the country in massive numbers. 400 or 5,610 took first-time approval for foreign employment in the latest reporting period, with another 280,314 seeking renewal. They're working in dangerous conditions in Gulf countries, Malaysia, and other nations, often facing exploitation and abuse. Some have even joined as mercenaries in the Ukraine-Russia war, with many returning home in coffins. A grim reality referenced in the protest placards. The remittances they send home now constitute over $11 billion annually, representing 26.6% of Nepal's GDP. Nepal's political system has become a machine for generating instability and corruption. Since the monarchy was abolished in 2008, the country has experienced constant government changes, with no administration completing its full term. A decade-long Maoist civil war that killed over 17,000 people. Persistent political interference from neighboring powers, India and China. A constitution-writing process that took years due to political disagreements. The result is a system where political parties form and break alliances based purely on power-sharing arrangements, with no regard for policy or governance. As former MP Parithapa noted, party principles, policies, and programs have absolutely no bearing on political alliances anymore. All that matters is rank and power. What made September 2025 different was that Nepal's Gen Z had found their voice through social media platforms. These young people had watched their parents' generation accept political failure and corruption as normal, but they weren't willing to do the same. Social media had given them tools to organize, expose corruption, and challenge authority in ways previous generations couldn't. The government's attempt to silence these platforms was seen as an attack on their fundamental rights and their only avenue for political expression. The Nepo Kids campaign that preceded the protests showed how effectively young Nepalis could use digital tools to challenge entrenched privilege. When the government tried to shut down their platforms, it backfired spectacularly. Nepal's Gen Z revolution fits into a broader pattern of youth-led uprisings across South Asia and beyond. From Sri Lanka's 2022 protests that toppled President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to Bangladesh's student movements, young people are increasingly willing to challenge established power structures. These movements share common characteristics: economic frustration, corruption anger, and sophisticated use of social media for organization. Nepal's protests were particularly notable for their complete rejection of traditional political parties. Organizers explicitly asked political parties and their youth wings to stay away. The violence in Nepal sent shockwaves across the region. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi called the situation heart-wrenching and chaired a meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Security to discuss developments. India placed its border on high alert to prevent spillover violence. Russia, Israel, and other nations issued travel advisories warning their citizens to avoid Nepal. The international community watched nervously as a strategically important nation wedged between China and India descended into chaos. With the civilian government effectively collapsed, Nepal's Army Chief General Ashok Raj Sigdal issued a statement late Tuesday, warning that all institutions were prepared to take control of the situation if unrest continued. The army deployed troops across Kathmandu and took control of key facilities, including the airport. However, rather than imposing martial law, the army called for dialogue with protesters, saying, "We appeal to the protesting group to halt protest programs and come forward for dialogue for a peaceful way out for the nation." This careful approach reflected the Army's awareness that traditional military solutions wouldn't work against a grassroots youth movement with broad popular support. The protests had no central leadership to negotiate with, making any resolution extremely complex. Nepal's Gen Z revolution of September 2025 represents more than just another episode of political instability. It signals the emergence of a new form of political rebellion in the digital age. When governments try to silence the connected generation, they risk unleashing forces they cannot control. The 22 deaths and hundreds of injuries were tragic, but they may have achieved something these protests couldn't, forcing Nepal's political establishment to confront the reality that business as usual is no longer acceptable. Whether Nepal can channel this revolutionary energy into genuine political and economic reform remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: the old guard of 70-plus politicians cycling through power while the country stagnates has been put on notice. For governments worldwide, Nepal's explosion should serve as a warning. In an age of social media and global connectivity, trying to silence young voices is not just wrong, it's dangerously counterproductive. The generation that grew up with smartphones will not accept the political failures their parents endured. The revolution may have started with a social media ban, but it ended with a simple message written on parliament walls: "We won." Whether the victory translates into lasting change will determine Nepal's future and possibly serve as a model for youth movements across the developing world.